If I told you that the borders of North America, like the very map of the continent as we know it today, were drawn, at least in part, because of a fashion trend.
You'd probably think it was a joke.
Right. I mean, you probably think I was completely crazy. You'd say, well, it was about gold or territory or religion. But today, we're doing a deep dive into the 10,000-year history of something you probably just threw on before you left the house this morning. The hat.
Yeah, it is entirely counterintuitive. We tend to view clothing as, trivial, just a byproduct of culture. But when you actually look at the historical timeline in these sources, the hat isn't just some accessory. It's really this defining silent book of human civilization.
That's a silent book. I love that.
Exactly. It's a mechanism that has literally driven global economies, sparked political rebellions, and enforced these really rigid social hierarchies.
Okay, well, let's unpack this, because to understand how a piece of clothing redraws a map, we kind of have to start at the very beginning. I want you to imagine you're sitting around the fire. It's roughly, 9,000 BC?
Right around there, yeah.
And the wind is just howling across the freezing plains of Anatolia, so modern-day Turkey. You're absolutely freezing. Specifically, your head is losing heat really rapidly.
Which is biologically a big problem.
Right. So driven by pure instinct, you grab the nearest animal pelt, you wrap it tightly around your skull, and you just think, much better.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's a purely functional moment. There's no grand design, no aesthetic choice.
Nobody cares if it matches their shoes.
Exactly. No one is color coordinating.
Yeah.
It's just raw human survival against the elements. But what's so fascinating here is how quickly humanity abandons that pure utility.
Yeah, we can't just leave things alone, can we?
Not at all. The moment we figure out how to survive,
Yeah.
we immediately start figuring out how to, signal our status to one another.
Right, because we fast forward just a bit into antiquity, looking at these ancient civilizations, and suddenly the hat goes from a survival tool to a literal physical map of power.
A very heavy map of power in some cases.
Yes. Take ancient Egypt. You're not just throwing a pelt on your head anymore. If you're the pharaoh, you wear the double crown. And it's this highly refined, deeply symbolic piece of engineering.
The double crown is actually the perfect early example of the hat as a silent book. Without the pharaoh having to say a single word, anyone looking at him knew exactly what he controlled.
Because of the colors, right?
Right. So the top part of the crown was white, representing Upper Egypt.
Right.
And then the bottom part was this rigid red structure, representing Lower Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
You had two distinct, massive nations, unified symbolically in one single object, sitting directly on the ruler's head.
But I was reading about the actual physical reality of wearing this thing, and it was massive. We're talking about an incredibly heavy, awkward structure.
Oh, absolutely.
It apparently required the pharaohs to develop immense neck muscles just to keep their heads up straight. Like, imagine balancing a large watermelon on your head all day, every day, while trying to govern an empire.
It sounds miserable.
It does. Why would anyone do that? Like, how do we go from wrapping a soft animal skin around our heads for warmth to enduring literal physical suffering and neck strain just for status?
Well, it represents a really profound psychological shift in human history. The utility of warmth is entirely replaced by the utility of visual dominance. Think about it. The bigger, heavier, and more rigid the crown, the more it physically separates the wearer from the everyday struggles of the common people.
Oh, because you couldn't actually do any work in it.
Exactly. A person who has to harvest wheat in the sun cannot wear a massive, heavy double crown. Therefore, wearing one proves you are exempt from manual labor. It is suffering, sure, but it's a highly calculated suffering that elevates you to the status of, basically, a living god.
Wow. Okay, that makes total sense. If you can afford to be that uncomfortable, you must be in charge. But it's not like every ancient culture went the route of heavy, painful crowns, right?
No, not at all. In ancient Greece, the philosophy of headwear was much more egalitarian. They developed something called the petasos.
The petasos. This was that wide-brimmed, soft, almost floppy hat, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like worn by shepherds, travelers, just everyday people trying to keep the Mediterranean sun off their faces.
It was highly practical, and it was really for everyone. And it was so ingrained in the Greek ideal of travel and movement that it actually crossed over into their mythology.
Right, with Hermes.
Yes. When you picture Hermes, the messenger god, you probably think of the little wings on his sandals.
Mm-hmm.
But he also explicitly wears a petasos. He has little wings attached to the brim of his sun hat.
I love that.
The underlying cultural message is brilliant, really. It says even divine beings need a good practical hat for the road.
Even the gods appreciate some good shade. But, if the Greeks were using hats for practical travel, the Romans turned the hat into something completely different. They turned it into a binding legal document.
They really did. In ancient Rome, the concept of freedom was incredibly complex, and it needed a visual shorthand. So when a slave was granted their liberty, they were given a specific piece of headwear called a pileus.
And it was just a simple felt cap, right?
Very simple, just a conical felt cap. But the moment you put that cap on your head, it functioned almost like a barcode. Every single person who saw you on the street instantly knew your exact legal standing.
You don't have to carry papers or anything.
No, you just wore the pileus.
And what absolutely blew my mind reading through the sources is that this specific hat, the pileus, essentially time traveled. It didn't just stay in ancient Rome.
Oh no. Fast forward 2,000 years to the late 18th century, the French revolutionaries are violently dismantling their monarchy, and they need a unifying visual symbol.
So what do they choose? The red Jacobin cap.
Exactly. And if you look at the design, it is a direct, deliberate copy of the Roman pileus. It's the exact same shape, utilized to signify the exact same concept, liberation from tyranny and newly won freedom.
History just repeated itself with a red dye job.
Basically, yeah.
That is incredible. A simple felt cap holds its political meaning across an entire continent and 2 millennia. But, okay, if the ancient world was using hats to communicate these big, sweeping concepts like the power of the gods or the liberation of citizens, the Middle Ages took things in a much more, micro-restrictive direction.
Restrictive is the perfect word for it. The Middle Ages turned headwear into a strict, legally binding social caste system. This is the era of sumptuary laws.
Okay, I want you, the listener, to really picture this. Imagine if you walked out of your house today and a police officer stopped you and wrote you a massive fine, or even threw you in jail because you were wearing a specific brand of beanie, and legally, only tech CEOs are allowed to wear that beanie.
That is a highly accurate analogy,
It's
actually.
insane. That is essentially what was happening, right?
Yes, sumptuary laws were literal clothing rules enforced by the state. A peasant could be severely punished for daring to wear a hat that was legally designated for a merchant, or a knight, or a noble.
It's basically the original Instagram profile.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Today, you click on a stranger's page, and within 3 seconds, you read their bio, you see what they do for a living, you gauge their social standing. In the Middle Ages, you just looked at a person's head. The hat gave you their entire bio instantly.
It was your calling card, your passport, and your social profile, all visible from down the street. But it's really important to understand why these laws existed.
Because it wasn't just snobbery.
Right. The sources make this very clear. We're not taking sides on the politics of the time, just reporting the history. But these laws were a deliberate, highly calculated tool for economic protectionism.
Give me an example of that.
Well, in 16th century England, the government passed a law requiring any male over the age of 6 of a certain lower social class to wear a specific type of knitted wool cap on Sundays and holidays.
Wait, legally mandated weekend wool caps? What is the logic there?
It was basically a government stimulus package enforced through your wardrobe.
You're kidding.
No, the domestic wool industry in England was struggling. Yeah. So the government essentially forced a massive portion of the population to buy local. If you were caught without your domestic wool cap on a Sunday, you were fined heavily.
The government forcing you to prop up the economy with your weekend headwear, that's wild. But because these hats were so heavily regulated and because they were the ultimate indicator of who you were in society, the craftsmanship required to make them was just unbelievable. You couldn't just order one online.
No, not at all. The hat-making guilds of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were incredibly intense, closed ecosystems. You couldn't just decide you wanted to make hats one day.
It was a whole process.
A rigorous journey. You started as a young apprentice, working for years just learning how to handle the raw materials. Then you became a journeyman, and eventually, maybe a master. We are talking about 7 to 10 years of dedicated daily training.
7 years just to learn how to make a hat. I mean, I know it's a craft, but what takes 7 years to learn?
Well, you have to understand how a true felt hat is actually made. You aren't just weaving threads together on a loom. Felting is a completely different physical process.
Okay. How does it work?
So, animal hair, whether it's wool or fur, has these microscopic barb-like scales on it. When a hat maker applies intense, boiling heat, constant moisture, and heavy physical pressure, those microscopic scales open up and interlock with one another.
So you're basically fusing the fibers together into a solid piece of fabric.
Exactly. You are engineering an impenetrable, incredibly durable mass. A master hat maker spent years learning the exact temperatures, the precise steam pressure, and the specific natural dyes needed to manipulate those fibers without destroying them.
They weren't making something you'd throw away after a season.
No. A properly felted hat was engineered to last 30 years. And because of the heat of your head over time, that interlocking felt would literally mold itself to the unique asymmetrical shape of your specific skull.
A 30-year investment that physically remembers the shape of your head. There is something profoundly beautiful about that level of slow, deliberate craftsmanship.
It's incredible.
But of course, human nature doesn't like slow. We always demand more, and we always want it faster and cheaper, which perfectly bridges us into the 19th century.
Yes. The old methodical guild system simply couldn't survive the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, you have steam-powered machines and massive factories that can pump out 1,000 hats a day.
The slow perfection of the master craftsman is replaced by the sheer volume of mass production.
Precisely.
And this demand for mass production sparks some of the most massive global geopolitical shifts in human history. Because the 19th century is the era of the top hat, the bowler, and specifically beaver felt.
Beaver fur felt becomes the absolute pinnacle of global luxury. And it wasn't just a vanity choice either. There were very practical mechanics behind it.
Because of the waterproofing.
Exactly. Because of the way beaver hair is structured, beaver felt is incredibly soft to the touch, but it holds a rigid structural shape perfectly. More importantly, it is naturally highly water repellent.
Which you need in London.
Right. If you are a gentleman walking around the foggy, rainy, smog-filled streets of 18th or 19th century London, a beaver hat acts like an umbrella for your head.
But the cost, I saw the numbers in the source material, and a single high-quality beaver felt hat could cost as much as a horse. A literal horse.
That price tag reflects a severe supply and demand crisis. The demand was just insatiable, but the European beaver had been hunted to the absolute brink of extinction. The forests and rivers of Europe were essentially emptied of beavers to feed the hatting industry.
Okay, wait. Here's where I have to push back a little. Because the European beavers are gone, the hatters look across the ocean to the New World, and the historical record suggests that this explosive demand for beaver fur was a central economic engine driving the early colonization of North America.
Yes, it was.
Are you seriously telling me that colonial borders were drawn over a fashion trend? Because that sounds like a massive exaggeration. Surely it was mostly about gold or territory or religious freedom.
Well, the search for gold and religious freedom are what get the bold headlines in high school textbooks, right? But if you look at the actual economic ledgers of the time, the sources say it is not an exaggeration. The fur trade, specifically driven by this European obsession with beaver hats, was a primary economic pillar.
Wow.
It funded massive expeditions. It established vast intercontinental trade networks with indigenous populations. The locations of early European trading posts and forts, many of which grew into major North American cities today, were dictated specifically by the migration patterns of the beaver and the logistics of shipping their pelts back to European hat factories.
So raw consumer demand for a water-repellent top hat literally mapped a continent. That is genuinely stunning.
It really is. But, eventually, the North American beaver population started taking a massive hit as well.
Because we just couldn't get enough of them.
Right. So the industry had to adapt again, and it shifted heavily toward wool felt. Wool was infinitely cheaper, it was easier to source, and it meant that by the mid-19th century, factories could produce hats cheap enough for literally every single European and American man to wear one daily.
And they absolutely did. It became a universal standard. Walking out of your house without a hat in the 1890s would be like, imagine walking out the door today without your smartphone. Or walking around a busy city without your AirPods in.
You'd feel completely naked.
Yes, it would feel completely unthinkable.
And that's a perfect modern parallel.
Yeah.
The hat went from being this elite map-drawing luxury item into the ultimate everyday cultural mask of the 20th century.
Which brings us to the golden era, the 1920s through the 1950s, the glamour, the film noir, the mystery. I mean, when I say 1940s private detective, every single person listening right now immediately pictures one specific hat, the fedora.
The fedora is arguably the most iconic silhouette of the 20th century, but its origins are wonderfully subversive.
I was so surprised by this.
Yeah, the name fedora actually comes from an 1884 theater play titled Fedora. And the title character was a Russian princess, and in the play, she wore a soft, center-creased felt hat.
Wait, let me get this straight. The most macho, hard-boiled, tough guy detective hat of the 20th century was originally invented for a female theater character.
Exactly. Women actually embraced the style first. It was a major trend in women's fashion long before men eventually co-opted it.
That is wild.
But once men took it over, it became the defining uniform of jazz clubs, prohibition gangsters, and that entire film noir genre. In those movies, the fedora acts almost as a supporting actor. It's a literal mask.
Right. A detective pulls the brim down low over his eyes to hide his intent.
Or he pushes it back to reveal a vulnerable face. It communicated a whole spectrum of psychological states without a single line of dialogue.
And the women of that era were using hats to make their own statements, too. In the 1920s, you have the cloche. This was that very tight bell-shaped flapper hat.
The cloche is a brilliant example of a hat as a direct political statement. If you look at the physical design of the cloche, it sat very low on the forehead and gripped the skull tightly. To wear it comfortably, you fundamentally had to have short hair.
You couldn't fit a ton of hair under it?
Exactly. You could not stuff a traditional Victorian waist-length hairstyle under a cloche.
And in the 1920s, a woman chopping off her long hair was a massive cultural shock. So wearing a cloche wasn't just following a cute fashion trend. It was a bold, highly visible feminist political statement.
Again, we're just reporting what the historians note here, but yes, by wearing that hat, you were broadcasting to the entire street your alignment with the new, liberated, modern woman.
It was rebellion in felt form.
Precisely. So for 10,000 years, from Anatolia to the flappers, the hat has been this uninterrupted constant in human expression.
Uninterrupted, right up until the 1960s. We go from every single person wearing a hat all the time to a sudden, absolute death of the trend. What on earth happened?
The decline is incredibly sharp. And while there were a few factors, historians frequently point to one specific highly televised cultural moment.
Okay.
John F. Kennedy's presidential inauguration in January 1961.
January in Washington, D.C. That must have been freezing.
That was a bitterly cold day. Now, traditionally, every incoming president wore a heavy top hat or a Homburg to the inauguration. It was just the uniform of power. But Kennedy, despite the freezing temperatures, deliberately chose to go hatless for the actual swearing-in ceremony and his speech.
Why? Just to show how tough he was.
Partly, but mostly, to project youth, vigor, and a distinct break from the past. Kennedy wanted to look like the future. The older, entrenched politicians standing around him on that stage, buried in their heavy coats and traditional hats, looked like the past.
So it's purely optics.
Yes. He was signaling a new, modern era, and the entire American public, and subsequently the world, was watching on television.
So, because of that one broadcast, the cultural perception flipped overnight. Within a decade, hats went from being a mandatory daily accessory to being the uncool thing your grandfather wore.
It really highlights the extreme fragility of cultural norms, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Think about the timeline we just walked through. You have 10,000 years of uninterrupted, legally mandated, economically driving hat wearing.
Entirely dismantled by a single televised moment by one charismatic politician.
The public's intense desire to emulate youth and modernity completely erased a 10 millennia tradition.
I have to say, looking back on all this, I kind of mourn the death of the everyday hat. It feels like we lost a really beautiful, expressive piece of our daily wardrobe. We lost that silent book.
Well, I wouldn't write the obituary just yet. The hat didn't die. It just retreated. It stepped out of the mass market spotlight for a few decades, but it is actually returning right now, especially in small, artisanal workshops, and it's returning with a completely new philosophy behind it.
The renaissance of slow fashion.
Yes. There's a major revival happening, driven by a desire for genuine individuality. A great modern comparison is to contemporary sneaker culture.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. Look at how people today will wait in line for hours or scour the internet for a limited edition specialized sneaker.
Yeah.
They don't just want footwear. They want something unique. They want something with a story behind it. Something that separates them from the mass-produced uniformity of fast fashion that you just buy at a mall.
And handcrafted hats fit perfectly into that modern desire because, physically speaking, no two human heads are exactly identical.
We all have little bumps and asymmetrical curves.
Right, which means if a hat is truly handcrafted and molded to the wearer, no two hats are identical. You're getting an absolute one-of-one item.
Exactly. And for someone looking to step into this world today, the recommendation from the experts is usually to start with a soft, moldable wool felt hat. something with a medium brim.
You don't want to start with a stiff, rigid top hat.
No, definitely not.
You want something you can actually shape. You might choose rich, deep colors, like a deep Bordeaux red or a warm tobacco brown. And the promise of a custom hat is that if you wear a high-quality wool felt piece regularly, after about 3 months, the heat and moisture from your head will physically alter the hat.
The interlocking fibers we talked about earlier will actually shift.
It becomes uniquely, permanently yours.
It biologically adapts to you. And that leads to the incredible emotional weight these physical items can carry over time. There's a story from a modern hat maker in the sources that perfectly encapsulates this.
The one about the grandfather's hat.
Yes. He describes a large, very quiet man coming into his atelier one afternoon, and this man is carrying his grandfather's hat.
A 63-year-old brown hat, and the description is wild. The brim was heavily chewed up by time, the felt was thinning, it was just completely worn down by decades of use.
The hat maker takes it in, and for 3 weeks he does this painstaking restoration work. He carefully sews in a new silk lining. He uses steam to gently reshape the brim without breaking the old fibers.
So he's not just making a new hat.
No, he restores the felt from the inside out, making sure not to erase the physical history and the character of the garment. And when the large, quiet man comes back to pick it up, he literally trembles holding it.
Oh, wow. Because he's not just holding a piece of clothing, he's holding a tangible piece of his grandfather's lived experience. So what does this all mean? How does a trembling man holding a 63-year-old restored hat redefine our modern concept of buying clothes?
Well, it forces us to confront how we consume today. We live in an era of fast fashion, cheap synthetic garments made in terrible conditions, meant to be worn 5 times and then thrown into a landfill.
And it leaves consumers feeling largely tired and empty.
The reality of a handcrafted hat that spans 3 generations offers a stark contrast. It shows us that true sustainability isn't some corporate marketing buzzword printed on a green tag. True sustainability is an heirloom.
Right.
It's the act of creating or buying something of such high quality and personal meaning that it inherently outlives the person who bought it.
That is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
We really have traveled a massive distance today. I mean, we started with a freezing human in Anatolia, just trying to keep the wind off their neck. We marched through the heavy, neck-straining double crowns of Egyptian kings into the strict, legally binding workshops of European guilds.
It covered a lot of ground.
We saw how consumer demand for a water-repellent beaver hat literally mapped the borders of North America, and we watched a young president freeze his ears off to kill a 10,000-year trend, all the way down to a trembling man holding his grandfather's restored felt hat.
The hat truly is a silent book of human history.
It really is. And that leaves us with one final, lingering thought for you to ponder long after you finish listening today. We've seen how a piece of felt-shaped global trade fueled gender rebellions and mapped out social hierarchies for 10 millennia. So as you look around your life today, what seemingly mundane, invisible, everyday item are you wearing or carrying right now that future historians will look back on as the defining silent book of our civilization?
It's a fascinating question. What is our equivalent of that first animal pelt drawn close against the cold?
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the everyday objects around you, and maybe think about throwing something on your head the next time you step out into the cold. See you next time.